My name is Kurvitz. I made a game called Disco Elysium. And thank you. That was very sweet of you, thank you. I consider myself to be, well, I make my money by being a writer. That has somehow mysteriously turned out to be the most monetizable skill that I have. And then I did a lot of that on the Disco of Elysium too. But my first suggestion to you, and then this is going to be like just basically a BuzzFeed article. I'm just going to list wisdom that I want to impart on you because I'm going to be 30 in 3 months. So everybody knows, no, 40 actually, sorry. I'm moving backwards in time. And then everybody knows that the moment you hit 40, you become incredibly wise. So I'm going to subject you to some of the wisdom that I've accrued over the years. And that topic is going to be world building because, and here's the first piece of wisdom, I don't consider myself a writer or a musician or a video game developer, which is one of the many things that I've done and had the privilege to do. I want to call myself something fancier. I want to call myself a world builder mostly. And I would very much suggest to anyone not to attach yourself to these beautiful giant words like writer or musician, because then you're going to be in competition with all the best writers in the world, and I've never wanted to do that. So there's this music producer called Brian Eno, and well, he could call himself a producer, but sometimes quite often he calls himself a sonic architect in liner notes, which I think is silly and cute. So my first suggestion is come up with a fantasy title, in D&D terms, a prestige class for yourself. In this way, you will never be in competition with anyone. You're not a writer, you're not a musician, you're some weird thing that you came up with, and I'm a world builder. So that's the capacity that I'm here with you today. I have another thing that I don't do. I don't prepare for speeches and apparently for workshops and things. So I just come and wing it. But world building is something that I think of anyway, every day, most of the time, maybe even half of the time I'm awake. So hopefully it'll be in some way useful for you because it's just what I'm thinking about anyway. I will try to just basically list things that I found useful or maybe in some ways even novel in world building. And I hope that some of these things are in some way useful for you in your career, in basically anything in entertainment. Because world building is a very important part of entertainment today. And I will try to do it in 3 parts. I will try to very shortly say what I think world building is, what it represents for investors today, and what it's generally in the entertainment industry. Then I will list my BuzzFeed suggestions to you. And then finally, I'll take a couple of questions if I have any time. I'm a very verbose person, so that might not happen, but let's see. So first of all, I would say that world building is more important than it has ever been. And that if you're interested in world building or if your job is to do world building, don't ever sell yourself short. You're worth $1 billion. If coming up with entire worlds is your passion, then yeah, don't let anyone tell you that you're not $1 billion in the making. Because if you look at it this way, there's been a long, I would say, perhaps trepidation in gaming essentially, especially, but also in other forms of entertainment, that perhaps TikTok is just going to come and take all our jobs. But I have learned from very smart investors that that's not actually how they see it. TikTok and the little fidgety things we do with our phones are what is called scattered time. And human beings always had scattered time. They just used to fidget with some straws or play a banjo or just sit around when they had scattered time. So scattered time is not going to take focus time. People still want to focus. I'm being very large picture McKinsey consultants here. But I found it very interesting to hear this, not my thoughts. And people still have a requirement for focus time. So what do people do in focus time? They play video games. That's one of the things they do. They also can maybe watch half a movie, and then TV series and books. So the requirement to focus is not going to go away, and it's not going to be eaten away by scattered time. So you're not out of a job. Good news. And when you do focus time, when human beings focus on things, they tend to want to focus, this is one of the things they like to focus on, is other worlds. They like to go away from their lives, from the day, into a alternative or slightly even dreamlike state. And this is what all video game people know is the coveted immersion, or I call it immersive time. And then as world builders, this is basically what we do. We build other worlds that people can go away to from this world of ours. And as people who provide that, you're never going to be in any way short of a job, because for some reason, people want to get away from our world more and more. Now, there are maybe different interesting theories that you can have why that's the case, but for some reason, in the age of modernity, we just come up with industrial amounts of other worlds, whereas in previous historical periods, you would have the heroic age for the Greeks. That was their world building. And everyone just set their stories in that one. And generally, it tended to be that all world building was something that happened 400 years ago when things were cooler, nicer, more heroic. And then for many reasons, one of them legal, because we no longer have legal access to other people's built worlds. That's no longer the case in modernity. Now, no one knows what modernity means or what it is. We have no idea of the time period we're in, but it seems to be something that's not very nice. People don't want to spend time here. And as world builders, this is what we do. We give them a little window into another place, and that window will always be an essential psychological good or virtue or very freeing experience. So you can come up with different theories why modernity is such a strange place that we suddenly need 10 million other worlds to go away to, not just one, but I think it speaks to something about the lack of heroism in our age, or how much stress here we have here. So anyway, that's just so you know a very, very large picture understanding of what I think of as world building. And you may have noticed I didn't use the word escapism. I don't think all world building is escapism. I mean, if you look at Homer, who wrote the Greek epics that completely shaped the Greek mind, I mean, he was probably not thinking that he's creating escapism. So I wouldn't suggest thinking of world building as escapism. I would think of as a vital psychological service to your fellow men. And doing that maybe sounds a little grandiloquent and some would say pretentious, but it also may help you aim high and not sell yourself short. Now, when money looks at you and you're a world builder, they think Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, dollar signs are in their eyes. 1 out of every million world builder builds an IP, and world building is seen as an incredibly quintessential element of IP. One might even say that world building is all of IP, even legally. If you start determining what is an IP, world building makes up most of it. Names, concepts, visual language. So it is big business, as they say. And don't take this little hiccup in capitalism too seriously that's taking place right now. I understand it's a very hard time. It's a hard time for all of us in gaming, but none of this little financial oddness has really changed what we're called upon to do as entertainers, and the audience is still out there, so keep strong and believe in what you do, and I think we'll get through it. Now, that's the boring philosophical part. I'm now going to try to workshop you. The first thing I would suggest, and I'm just going to brutally and boringly suggest things to you to do as world builders. This does not mean, I'm going to preface it, this is not the only way to do world building. This might not even be the way I do world building. It might be the way that it sounds good for me to say that I do world building. But nonetheless, I hope some of it might be useful for you. So, number one, don't do high fantasy. Just don't. Don't do it. The reason for that is the same as why I don't suggest being a writer, because chances are you're not going to be a better writer than Émile Zola. You're not going to write a book better than Germinal. Why try to be a writer? Be something else in which you can be the best or among the best. So high fantasy was already done as well as it is possible to do high fantasy by this guy called Tolkien, who I'm sure we all respect. And you can just understand that you won't be able to make better high fantasy than Tolkien by looking at the names of Tolkien's places. So names are, this will be a recurring theme in this little wisdom sharing exercise. Names are incredibly important to world building, and when I look at built worlds, I go immediately to the names. And well, Tolkien has like 4 good names for one mountain, and that's one mountain. He has 4 mountains. So if your setting, high fantasy setting, has a name in it as good as Karadharas, all right, now we need 7 more. If it has a city of elves in it as good as Lothlorien, I'm sure you're going to get funding once funding returns to planet Earth. But chances are that might not be the case. And I started out as a high fantasy world builder. I wanted to build the best world that was ever built because I was 16 years old, and I dropped out of school. So I had only my belief in myself. So I had to overly inflate it. And quite quickly I understood that I'm just creating lesser versions of Tolkien's work. It's even somewhat offensive to even call his work intellectual property, and I don't think that's quite how it works. So you might say the second thing, which is, yeah, but Tolkien's world isn't really a world-building world. It's not really an IP. You can't set TV series in it. We have seen that's not physically possible, actually, although you might try. It is not very easy to play D&D in Tolkien's world, because constantly you're going to have to create something as noble and Christian, because that's a very Christian world, as Tolkien's characters. And chances are you're going to be a bit like me. Your elven names are going to be a little lamer. So there's also already an answer to that too. This is called Forgotten Realms. Forgotten Realms is basically the perfect middlebrow fantasy setting that just relaxes some of the style guidelines a little bit so everyone can have fun in it, make some jokes. It's basically a vulgar version of Middle-earth, yeah, a secular version of it, like a bar song or like a punk rock track, and which is super cool. But over the years, Forgotten Realms has just become very, very good. It has great names. If you look at it, Amn, great name. Icewind Dale, great name. Baldur's Gate, okay name, but Neverwinter, great name. Vasa, good name. So I could just go on. And also notice that these can also be used as adjectives. So this is another tip. If you name something, then it has to be a good adjective for a place too. So Amn, Amnish, Baldur, Baldurian. Great names. That's why I think it won over Greyhawk and all of these other settings and kind of subsumed them into itself. So that's great fun, but it already exists. So the question is, can you make one more fun? And I'm not saying you can't, but I suggest you don't. Don't try. So another suggestion that now comes to mind is do, of course, whatever else you want to do, it's also important to understand that you can always have high fantasy elements in other worlds. And then this is a real thing that I've learned, which is that the elements that make high fantasy so fun and adventurable and iconic can just be transposed onto other settings. So a sci-fi setting can have the same elements of a high fantasy setting. What does a high fantasy setting really have? A place to gather in certain stereotypes or archetypes of characters, deep history, group dynamics already out of the box, characters that players can just immediately understand who they are and so on. These all things, if you really look at high fantasy, and I suggest you do, you can pick it apart into elements, see why it works, and you can bring those elements into another setting. So you can get the coziness, the fun, and so on, without trying to outdo Tolkien and Forgotten Realms in medieval fantasy. Like transposing is a word from music, which is basically taking one melody and putting it into another chord, and which is the reason why all of modern music exists. Basically, all melodies are other melodies that are just transposed into another chord. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to even legally make music nowadays anymore. So you can do the same thing with high fantasy. Another suggestion I would have is, and this is going to feel almost impossible to do, but I'm going to give it anyway. I think a world needs to be built for at least 5 years before showtime. So at least 5 years before you get into the project. Until you start using it in a game, or even quite often in a book. Now, I know I already see a couple of my friends in the audience who have built really cool worlds in like a week. But I'm of a different school. I started doing world building because I thought it was just the grandest thing to do, come up with an entire other world. And I have seen, how do I say, examples from other world builders that seem to say that I'm correct in this 5-year assessment. For example, Dragon Age, BioWare IP, though I'm not an incredible fan of the word IP, but BioWare World was built for 3-4 years before they started making Origins. So they put a lot of time into just coming up with all of that stuff. And if you play at Dragon Age Origins, you can see that it's really deep, interesting. They have these cool concepts about golems in that world, and then they've kind of changed some of the high fantasy language around and have kind of cleverly chosen certain things from G.R.R. Martin's work, which at that time was quite novel to pick from it. So it has this quite heavy tradition to it already. And of course, Tolkien spent about 20 years building his stuff. And then it goes on and on. William Gibson developed his style and his vision of the future for about 7-8 years before. I think I'm not a literary scientist, so don't quote me on these. But as you can see, it takes a long time, definitely longer than it is usually done in video games. Now, video games like to do about a year of pre-production, and then the world's supposed to go. For Disco Elysium, we did world building for about 10 or 15 years before we used it in a game. And what it allowed me to do was basically walk on water when we produced it, under which I mean I had a solution for everything. I had a joke beforehand. I knew exactly what was happening in this world, and it was almost as if I couldn't do wrong going about these stylistic elements that we had built, because I had so much to draw from. So this is, I understand, very difficult to say to someone who has to work on video game, how do I say, timelines, but my suggestion would be that if you're interested in world building, then you take it up as a hobby and you build a really cool world, hopefully with some other people. It's fun that way. And then when you get a chance to make a game out of it, you'll have something in your back pocket. You don't have to only build the world. You can do other jobs on the side, but I would suggest building this, what in psychology is called a paracosm, which children sometimes come up with. Building this paracosm for yourself of these thoughts and ideas, names and places, for when the time comes. You will definitely not regret the time you put into it. my next suggestion would be and this is a very dry legal one, but it comes from a very, how do I say, hard-earned personal experience, is that when the time comes to use your world in a game or in a Netflix series or wherever, but mostly for you in a game, make sure that you own the majority or are part of the majority forming coalition in the company that owns that IP. So over 51% generally, I mean obviously have a lawyer present. Be a lawyer, like have your mom be a lawyer generally in life. Or have a sidekick like Kim Kitsuragi, but he's a lawyer, basically. My suggestion to you, but nonetheless, it really comes down to this, that if you don't have majority control of the company where the IP is at, then in, sadly, the place that the entertainment industry is at, you might lose control of it. And now, I will tell you, there is nothing more heartbreaking than losing control of something you've come up with for what I've suggested is 5 years, for example. Imagine being Tolkien and getting to write Fellowship of the Ring, and then we're bringing in other people to write Two Towers. It's not going to be a very enjoyable process for you to see that Two Towers be written by someone else, because all of the effort you put into world building is going to be undone. And this happens quite often because people in business have this unfortunate view of world building that it's just intellectual property and can be picked up by anyone, which it can't. You know, Star Wars is George Lucas. For better or for worse, when you hear George Lucas's ideas about Star Wars, those ring true to you. That's Star Wars, even if you don't agree with them. And other people doing Star Wars are spin-offs of Star Wars, but they don't have that same soul. So make sure that that soul stays within the world that you built. Now, of course, a lot of you might say, but I work at a company, you know, I have a working arrangement with them that generally in most legal spheres, the European Union included, means that the company owns all of the IP that you create. So you will be creating a world for another company. My suggestion, don't create your best world for that company. Give them your B role and say, oh, you want my A role? Give me 51% of the company. And then don't settle for vetoes, points, or any other things that your lawyers might tell you that aren't that enforceable. Now, perhaps more creative topics next. As I said, I think the most important attributes of a built world are names. Names of characters, names of places. That's also what the legal system thinks. And likely appearances, so that means basically concept art to some extent as well, but not so much. It's when you really try to define what Star Wars is, or what Middle-earth is, or what Elysium is, the world that I spent my life on. It's just a collection of names. Names for places, names for people, and names for concepts. Now, I'm going to bring an interesting example as to, you know, I threw the gauntlet in your face. I said you need mountain names as good as Karadharas, so I might try to give you a little hint as to how to get good names. I can't repeat enough how important they are. Really, if your capital city is called Rexholm, then that sucks, you know. I even have like a generator in my brain that generates bad fantasy names, which I think you all probably have too by now. So give it a whirl and then see that your good names aren't coming from that one. Now the question becomes, where do you get good names from? If like a good world has good names, and even Star Wars has very good names. Tatooine is a great place. George Lucas has his wacky, weird, personal approach to names, which is fun and silly, but very striking at the same time. And that's his personal style that people try to emulate, but it is just an emulation. So the way I do it is that I use Wikipedia a lot. Big surprise. This is another hint. Live in Wikipedia. Like, it is the greatest thing on internet, and then the more tabs you have open, the better things are going for you as a world builder. And the way I do it is, after a while I understood that the names need to be more rad than they are, and then I started just looking at names in the real world. And then the trick I did was I stopped competing against the names of Tolkien, and I started competing against an even better naming standard, and that's the naming standard of reality, the real world. Our world has mesmerizingly beautiful names. The cities are called Arkhangelsk, Astrakhan, Berlin. If you're able to come up with something like that, you're on the money. And that was a way that I could circumvent the specific world building of Tolkien, and we just started emulating, or trying to at least, and we of course were not successful at it, but tried to compete with real world names. I'll just bring a good example of how to do that. Do not look where other people are looking into. So don't look into ancient Rome. Don't. Look a little, but everyone's already there. That vein has been mined already before you got there, before you were born. So here, I think in world building, what was once frowned upon as hipsterism, but that's actually cultivating a professional language that you as artists need to do. Hipsterism is sadly just a side effect of being an artist. You need to know rad stuff. And in names, I would say, cultivate an interest in cultures that everyone hasn't been around yet. I'm going to bring some weird examples. Did you know that the Sardinians, before it got named, in this weird name that Sardinia kind of brings into mind the sardine, bad association, probably not good for world building, but the original name it comes from is Shardu, much better I would say, a Neolithic civilization who built these beautiful earthen mounds in the mountains in Sardinia. So already an interesting naming section, Shardu, what do we do with that? Another one, they have these earthen structures are called names like Su-Muravi. So Su is one syllable in that. Like, if you have a place name that's trying to get that kind of vibe, it's going to sound novel and hopefully unexpected for people. I'll bring another example of how world builders have used it to great effect. Hipsterism, or just essentially cultivating a more niche reference library. Dune, Frank Herbert. Not a terribly good book, incredible world building. So, for example, the Kwisatz Haderach sounds pretty serious. Like, it sounds like a real thing. That's what you want your terms and things to sound like. And it doesn't sound like it's of our earth. It comes from another place. Well, he didn't use Wikipedia. He didn't have that. He just went to libraries. And then he knew that there is such a thing as a Circassian hunter language. So Circassians were Central Asian tribes. They're considered to be the most beautiful people in the world, who got into a spot of genocide trouble, I believe, with the Russians. And then they dispersed and then became heads of aristocracies in this Arab world. So Frank Herbert knew this, and then they knew that they have a hunting language, a hunter's language, where they, which is used by hunters of animals to communicate. And Kwisatz Haderach literally means the shortening of the way, or something about the way there. Again, don't quote me on this. I just went on Wikipedia 3 weeks ago, so this might be incorrect, but as you can see, he has mined into a part of the world that not everyone knows about, so it seems completely novel. A lot of world building is just smoke and mirrors. It's just people who have very specific tastes that are not a mainstream knowledge. You're just educating people on cultural touch points that they're not that used to. So basically, in my mind, I have the map of the world and I just don't go to certain places. Another good idea is world building is also about negative spaces, what not to use. So in Elysium, we decided it would be interesting to look at a world that hasn't had an ancient world experience of slavery, where other evils came about, where slavery was already eradicated 3,000 years ago. And that creates difference, a certain difference in how things are going. But also you can look aesthetically. In Elysium, we decided that America doesn't exist. We're going to try a world where the lingua franca isn't American, where it's French. You will see this as a compliment, hopefully. Napoleon's plan worked out. And that this creates a huge novelty in the setting, I believe, and helped us look at things from another direction. So, yes, cultivate a personal reference library that other people don't know about. Look into little obscure cul-de-sacs of history. Don't think about Napoleon, think about Tamerlane. There once used to be a great conqueror who the peoples of Europe called Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, as in limping in one foot. The Timurid dynasty, no one really thinks about it nowadays. Might be a good way to enrich your next world building project. So another thing that I have is called a name bank. I became basically a manic or a maniac of names. And I just started collecting all of the cool names that I've ever seen in hyperlinks or anywhere. And then I think it's now tens of thousands of entries long, probably. It looks like a maniac scribblings. But that means that whenever time comes, whenever I need a name, I'll just pick out whatever I found from the Timurid dynasty, what sounded cool, and I have an answer to these things. Another thing you might want to do is, you might want to, when you're coming up with names, use them in sentences and give them a test run, so to say. So, if I maybe have time, I have an instructive story about this. It's a little, how do I say? I hope you appreciate that I'm going to show how lame my ideas once were. It's going to take a little out of me to share some of my embarrassing world building things, but here's the thing. We wanted Elysium to have a desert. And the names of deserts in real world and in world building settings are really, really cool. They're always very, very cool. So we needed to have a very cool name. So this hopefully shows how you can get names better, and especially how you can use years and years of iteration on names for them to become better and better, because you're going to want to have a map, names on it, and then the things that sound lame, you cut those out. A year later, believe me, you're going to be wise as to what didn't work and what works. So we knew we're going up against some pretty good names, even in fantasy worlds. For example, Armagast is a name in a CRPG called Arcanum. It's a pretty cool name for a desert. I won't say it's the ultimate name for it, but that's where, you know, the competition was. No, actually, Armagast is in Dan Simmons's Hyperion Saga, the name of a desert planet. Arrakis is the name of Dune, or Dune is another name for a desert planet. Vendigroth was the name of Arcanum's desert. So we were like, okay, Elysium needs a cool desert, and it's got to sound good. So we all presented our ideas. We used MS Paint to write the word down in cool letters, which I don't suggest you do. That's cheating. Just write it in uncool regular letters. So I came in and I had written on it. I showed it to my friends. My friends were all there. And it said, and I'd thought about it for like a month or two at that point. So we have the best world ever. Obviously, it's going to be cooler than Star Wars and Middle Earth and all of those things combined. I'm not in school anymore. All day long, I just lay about and I think about desert names. And here it is. Here's what I came up with. Indigreed. Someone in the back row says, inbreed. So another friend who was a little bit more tactful said, so my first reaction was, of course, no, indigreed is cool, you guys are wrong, it's the coolest name for a desert ever. And then the more tactful friend was, Indi is a good combination of syllables. There's worth in that. They're not boring syllables. It's a good combination. Not sure about the greed, how's it even written? So a week later or 2 weeks later, that same friend came with his own idea. It was also written in really cool letters, and it said, fuga. Now, that's the Estonian version of the word fugue. If you're in a fugue state, that's related to sleep and hypnosis. So pretty cool idea for a desert, very trippy. But the friend in the back goes, tuba. Womp, womp, womp. So, associations, you gotta be careful with them, obviously. But you can see it didn't quite work out. So, a little time goes past, and I'm looking at names for other things in that world, and see we have this huge map where we have all of the names on. And this is a trick that works very often, which is you bring a side element name where you haven't had the stress of coming up with a desert name as cool as Vendigrov, and you bring it to the center. So when you had less, it's like a B-side, bands used to do them, you have less creative stress, you can come up with cooler ideas. So there I had a concept or a name which came out as Ilmara. So Ilmara is what we went with. Ilmara probably comes with your French, so it probably was my mind trying to say island of Mara. I was a huge fan of history at that time, and that painting, which we all love, of Mara in his bath. So I was like, oh, okay. And it's a kind of Estonianization of a French word, so it has a language genesis that's not very mainstream. So the island of Mara, just calling a desert Île Mara sounded wonderful. Someone's calling me. I'm not going to take it. So we decided we're going to go with that. Now, is it as good as Sahara, Gobi? No. But I think it's maybe a little better than some of the desert names in America. And I'm not going to say which, because you will disagree and it'll ruin the joke. But now see, I'm going to have to take it. Scott, I'm on stage. Goodbye. Because I came unprepared, so I need to use this for my notes. I'm very sorry for this unprofessionalism. So we didn't make a desert name that's necessarily better than the real world, but I hope this kind of inspires you and shows you how you can make mistakes and how you can iterate upon this stuff. And it's worth to do it. In the end, you will get a cool thing. You'll go to sleep every night and you'll say, my desert is called Île Mara, not Fuga. And that'll feel like a victory for you. Now, another thing we noticed there is saying things out. So if you use it in a sentence, you will understand if something is lame. This is something my dad told me one day, and I understood it later. So if you say around, he has arrived at Fuga, the Fuga stands out, there's something wrong there. This young man comes from Indigreed. One of these words is kind of standing out. It doesn't have what is called verisimilitude or likeliness to truth, which is a virtue that you really want everything in your world building to have realism or verisimilitude. But if you say he comes from Île Mara, it flies under the radar. It doesn't stick out as a sore thumb. So test drive these names. And I'm not even going to tell you about character names. I hope quite a lot of you are probably writers of some type because you came here. So I think you're cursed with it probably. So you all know about how J.K. Rowling comes up with his character names and has this bank of these wacky names. Obviously, your character names are going to have to be good, but those are much easier, by the way, than place names. A little trick that you can do to come up with names, by the way, is misreading things. Sometimes when you see something's written somewhere, you see it slightly differently. Your brain jumbles it up for a moment. I had an example of this, which is on Reddit, someone misread something and came up with a place name Irensaga. It's not bad, it's a pretty cool name. It's probably Isengard. But when you look at something and your brain doesn't quite read it, you can be in this dream state where you misread it. And sometimes those misreadings can be quite helpful. Take this as a little Dadaist trick for coming up with stuff. Now, after this long and very technical name mania, maybe some more mainstream or general humanitarian tips. When you build your world and your concepts and the things that you're interested in, what I tried to find is, I tried to find two things. This world will need to go into writing. People will need to express their pain and their longing in it. They will need to entertain people in it. This will be a toolbox that everyone is going to use. And for that, I have a little test, and actually a couple of tests that I'm going to suggest to you. But the first test that I do is, I imagine, okay, I'm going to have to actually write this stuff. I'm going to have to write 100,000 words, maybe 1 million words in this world. So how do I make it possible? And my answer is, I find the humor and the heartbreak in this world. I don't think it's possible to write long tranches of text and stay actually motivated to do it without being what is called, what in 2019 was called back on your bullshit. So after you've been very friendly with everyone and come up with cool names and hopefully haven't done a fantasy world, but instead have transposed something onto a science fiction world, especially extra points go to you if you build a modern built world. Elysium is one of those, and a lot of people lately have started in the last 20 years building modern other worlds. They're very interesting thought exercises, at least. So I try to understand how I can make jokes in this world. So that's one of the litmus tests that the world needs to pass, that this needs to be funny. Your bitterness, your pain needs to be in there. The time you got fired from your job, your anger at things in the world. If you cannot transpose them onto this built world, then it is going to be hollow. Worlds have their inside jokes. They're built of bitterness and hope and then broken dreams and resuscitated dreams. And then if the jokes that you and your friends do translate into the world that you make, then you know that you will have hit something really, really special that people are going to want to come and experience, because you and your friends, not using our world things, but other worldly things, to talk about trance music and the time you did drugs, there is something very novel and special in it. So I suggest finding the humor and making sure that you can make jokes in that world. And the other is heartbreak. I think that's quite self-explanatory. No point building worlds that you can't talk about getting dumped in. A friend of mine once said that no one reads anything for any other reason than love, and in some way I think that's completely true. So another thing you might want to check is that your world is ready for heartbreak. And the final thing that I have to suggest to you is a very technical and hard thing to try to aspire towards, and I can't say that I have completely been able to achieve this even in Elysium, where I put an inordinate amount of time under. But this is, if you take one point from this listicle of suggestions, I would suggest you take this. This and the lawyer thing. Make sure that the world you build can tell as many genres of stories as possible. So quite often a world is only usable for an adventure story. Adventure is the most coveted genre of writing in video games because it goes well with game mechanics. But the next one would be, yeah, but can I also tell a detective story in this world? Detective stories are widely the most entertaining and populist type of story, a whodunit. It just works. So that's why even in D&D you have murder mysteries and the investigation skill and stuff. Disco Elysium really takes this to a quite esoteric lengths, this murder mystery world building thing. Murder mysteries are good because they talk about the material reality of your setting. So a detective will need to understand that this cup was made. Well, why does it say wildery? It's made of paper now. See, quite a lot of world building is already in here. We know that we fucked up with plastic. So we need to make them out of this soggy cardboard now. I'm sure this name means something, and there's a serial number there, all little elements of verisimilitude, that if your world doesn't have this level of realism, then you're not going to be able to build very good detective stories in there. But now these are very low-hanging fruits. There are other much more difficult genres to write in, and I'm going to go through some of them. One of the most difficult things to get working in your built world is a spy thriller. Now, I don't mean a James Bond spy thriller or like a parody of a spy thriller. I mean an actual, like, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy or Bureau of Legends, for which, by the way, thank you, French people, the best spy thriller ever written. Better than John le Carré stuff and the new hallmark in really credible and beautiful spy thrillers. Now, can you tell that story in your built world? Huge challenge, of course, but it is possible. The names of the nation states on behalf of whom the spying is being done need to be incredibly stylish and cool. You will need to have real-world references, otherwise the comedy and the anger of spy movies, the Americans coming in, the Russians coming in, you don't have any of that to lean on. So you might want to have elements of known or geopolitical actors in our time in it. Now, really, really difficult to achieve, and I almost never got to that point in Elysium where I was like, yeah, I know exactly how to do a spy story. By the way, Dragon Age, Dreadwolf was supposed to be a spy story, so the people who wrote Dragon Age got to a point where we're so confident in that world, they thought, all right, let's tell a spy story here. We have gotten Orlais to a place where it's cool enough, and other places. By the way, don't call anything Orlais. People will know that you're trying to say Orléans and switch one syllable out, with absolute respect to the people who wrote Dragon Age. It's a wonderful world, but it usually doesn't work. I would rather suggest just using Orléans. Just use it. Just use a slightly different spelling of it. No one's going to be angry at you because you called a large part of your world Vasa, although it's a name of a ship and a city in Finland. You might not want to take something so grand and so known as Orléans, but anyway, I digress. Really try to make a spy thriller work there. But now you can start having romantic comedy. Does that work? Mass Effect really makes romantic comedy work. You can do a lot of good stuff if your world can also carry an adventure story and a romantic comedy. The ultimate test I propose is autobiographic novel. The most boring, grandest genre ever. Something that's called something like Tunbridge Wells, one person's life from the beginning to end. Where were they born during a snowstorm? In a military hospital somewhere, what town, what city, who were their parents, what's their lineage of their families, and so on. To their death, if you can narrate a person's life story, which is as rich as your own, with all the cafes they went to, all the girls they had hopes in, and all the political beliefs that they had, the waves of history throwing them around, if you can write that life story in another world, then you will probably have built a perfect built world. A complete copy of ours. Nabokov tried that with Ada or Arthur. He had this very novel Otherworld where he wrote the life story of some siblings who were up to Nabokov stuff, because it's Nabokov. So a literary scientist can say whether it is a built world and how successful it was, but there is an example of someone having already tried to do it, and that one person is Nabokov, a pretty esteemed writer. So this is the test that you might want to take. And trying to imagine what a autobiographical novel or a spy thriller will be in your world, it will really, really help you fill in the gaps of this world and make it much grander. You will understand that you need not only large states, but middle players. You will need names of streets. You will need all the ephemera. I don't even know how I've only seen it written, so if I mispronounced it, excuse me, but you will need all the ephemera of our world. The matchbox will need to look like a matchbox, and it needs to be made in a factory somewhere in a place. So that, I would say, is the ultimate suggestion. Basically, take 10 years, write an autobiographic novel in another world, and write it in a book. That's another suggestion. Really, that's my final one for today. Before you use your world in a video game, write it in a book. It will give you a legal advantage. It will give you in France, it will give you an indomitable legal advantage, but everywhere in the world, at least a moral advantage, and you will get to road test it without international finance coming in, because in today's world, I don't know if you knew this, but if you and your friends want to meet each other 5 days a week, then an investor needs to own 40% of what you're coming up with during those meetings. It's just that kind of world. But if it's you alone, just on your computer, that's the cheapest way to world build and to create these things. So that's my final thing, a little bonus suggestion to you. I think we have about time for 2 questions or something, because I went over time here. So let's have 1 or 2 questions, and then I can... 3 or 4 is fine, all right?
Hi, I'm here on your left.
Hey yo.
I want to piggyback a little bit on your conclusion. And first of all, I want to thank you for this inspiring talk and for your life's work, really. It's left a big impression on me and on many other people. But yeah, you mentioned during the talk that creating with other people is more fun, and then you conclude by saying, take your creation for a spin on your own computer. I know, for instance, well, you started by creating an art collective, I think.
Yeah.
So, my question is, could you give any recommendation or advice for people who might be starting up to look for this kind of structure in a world that's more and more isolating and money-driven?
Yeah, I looked for the word for what me and my buddies created when we dropped out of school together. And I think art movement is, no one understands what it means. It's called a gang. Like, that's the best word. It's an art gang. I think everyone understands those. And yeah, I know, I understand it's, how do I say, contradictory suggestion, but companies come and go, even nations come and go, but companies definitely come and go. So yeah, I would definitely suggest that when you're building a world, or anything really, that you really put people first and friendships first. The greatest asset in your life for world building or achieving anything will be that brilliant friend of yours. That they come with their problems, everyone does. You know, if you're not, in this world you can choose to be either alone or forgiving. I suggest forgiving. So, yeah, I've heard from other people who have seen what I have done, that they're building a gang of their own to start doing a world and so on. In just games, it's called networking. But a good time to start networking is 18, 19, when you can really build that bratty gang of dudes around you. You need an artist. You need a philosophy guy. Someone needs to understand Hegel and actually read him. I don't, but I had a guy for that. So I feel like I did. You know, it's good to have a programmer, but to be totally honest, that's not super important for world building. You can never know too many great writers in your life, and musicians too. That's just an unbelievable gift to have a friend there. So yes, cultivate friendships, be forgiving, try to, again, I can't, like, while I said that 5 times a week you can't meet with your friends without an investor owning 40% of what you do, which is literally the world that we are in, the world that they built for us. You can meet them once or twice. You do even on weekends without investors needing to be there. So use that time, hang out, have a lot of coffee. You French people know how it's done. Pay each other's bills and help each other. And when the day comes, you know, in games or anything, it doesn't matter what you've done or what your CV says you've done or what your title was in anything. It's what you can actually do. And you know what these people can actually do because you were layabouts with them for years. And fight for that time in your life. By the way, it's called your 20s. Don't do anything in your 20s. Don't work, nothing. Be a complete parasite. Just chill out and come up with cool stuff. And if someone tells you not to do it, tell them to F off, basically. Next.
Hi. I have a rather simple yet extensive question. What is your relationship with intertextuality? Or if I shake things a little bit, what would you think of Neil Gaiman's body work, for instance?
I'm not a huge fan of Neil Gaiman. I don't know, I'm not supposed to say it. He was a really, really important step in the development of popular culture. That's one thing I have to say. The other thing I have to say is I haven't read any of his work. I'm one of these people who, like, I have a joke, which is I'm not a reader, I'm a writer. But I think, if I may say one thing about it is, this is a weird suggestion, but you know, Neil Gaiman is probably really interesting for you to read, so you can understand what cool world building can be done by calling a god Wednesday, and then he's Odin and stuff like that. He has cool ideas. But another thing you can do is not to read some famous things, which everyone else has read. You know, work with negative space. I have some things, everyone in Eastern Europe reads Master and Margareta. They just think it's the coolest book out there. I haven't read it, never will. I don't want to be one of the guys who references Master and Margareta. I never read Marquez. I'm sure it's an unbelievably good experience, but I don't want to be another person who does that. This is just me trying to defend not having read any Neil Gaiman here. Houdini myself out of the question. But you said intertextuality, or yeah. What is it?
Intertextuality.
Yeah, what is it? Sorry. Yeah.
I would say the art of coming to something new with something very old.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, juxtaposition and then taking Bronze Age things and moving them to the present. Absolutely, that is the core of creativity. Creativity is just simple. It's memory and association speed in your brain. You can really improve your memory by just cramming it full of Wikipedia. And association speed, God either gave you or didn't. You can definitely lessen your association speed by doing a lot of drugs. So take care of your neurological health. And then your brain is just like a particle collider. It will just jam these references together and you will come up with a new thing. So yes, big on intertextuality if it means that.
Sorry, I have misjudged the verbosity, so we won't have much time for the questions.
Oh.
So thank you, Robert, again, and
thank
good night,
you.
everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Eve for setting it up for me. Thanks, Eve.